morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever it might be, wherever it is that you are. My name is John. I'm here with Christos. We're starting a new show today called Identity Crisis, which was a bit of trivia. It was actually going to be the name of the of our other show, but the marketing said no. So they said no, we don't think that'd be good. It doesn't draw the right correlations.
We found a good excuse to find another place to do our identity crisis.
That's right.
You can't stop us.
So we're starting a new series today, and it's going to go on every Tuesday. And we're going to talk about the why behind the how. So
Yes.
So we spend a lot of time. Christos and I spend a lot of time building stuff on our main show and on our main channel, and that's cool and it's a lot of fun. But it doesn't always lend us enough time to talk about the why. Why are we doing things this way? Why do we have to do them this way? And so that's the point of this show. Is we're going to try to spend an hour over the next few weeks, every Tuesday, talking about why things are the way they are. Why is identity the way it is? Why is it frustrating? Why is it irritating? Why is it something that people struggle with? And so we want to bring some of that and bring on some guests and talk about just what makes identity, and why we've gotten to the place that we are. So so we work in the identity division at Microsoft. So our job is to hang out with developers and help them use our platform and be successful. And we both come from development backgrounds, and so we tend to spend a whole lot of our time with developers. And we have certainly seen over the years all the different problems, issues, concerns that identity can bring. So we're excited to be here. Christos?
A lot of frustration. So we're trying to disambiguate some of the terminology, some of the hard things that we tend to brush over when we do the other streams, and the things that we don't really have time to do. So this is a lot of one-on-one kind of content that we're trying to cover. And if we see that people have questions and want more advanced things, then please feel free to let us know, because we definitely want your guidance on where we should take the show.
Yeah.
And we'll start with the super basic stuff. So if you find this interesting or not interesting enough, just let us know. We'll adapt. But we know there's a lot of developers out there that fear identity. They fear authentication. They fear authorization because it's a complex thing. Trust me, I fear, and I still fear a lot of these things because I'm still learning. So the journey never stops, and things move on all the time. Like we added Pixie support, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, and it was all new, right? Because I think it was back in March, so it was all new. So what was Pixie? In fact, I didn't even know how to spell Pixie. I was looking for Pixie. I was like, I can't find anything on authentication in Pixie. These PKCE. But let's start from the beginning, and let's start from the start, and So today we'll introduce the show. We'll talk about what we're gonna be covering over the next few weeks, and then hopefully we'll start bringing some guests as well, so they can go in super depth on certain things. Right?
Yeah. So our hope is that this is a show for people who don't know anything about identity. There's no prerequisite that you have any sort of a background in what identity means in terms of a digital identity or anything like that. So if you're a startup, if you're a student, if you're someone who's just interested or someone who's had to deal with identity issues in the past, this is the show for you. So we are going to talk a lot about what makes up identity systems and the kinds of problems that we have to solve. And we'll look at how we solve them in our platforms, but how others have solved them in their platforms historically as well. And really focus on the underpinnings and things like protocols and tokens and what are they and why do we have to use them. But before we get there, we kind of have our main question, right? The main question that centers around everything related to identity is who are you? Who are you? It sounds easy on the surface to solve. It sounds like it'd be a relatively easy question, but anybody who's got 8,000 passwords in their password manager or 4,000 sticky notes on the side of their monitor for accessing all the different systems they have to do their job.
Please use a password manager. Please use a password manager, no sticky Sticky notes.
Yeah, anyone who's in that situation,
Yeah.
which I assume is probably most anybody who's a modern denizen of the internet. That's one of the hardest problems to solve is who are you, because there aren't that many systems anymore that just rely on that don't require an identity, right?
Yeah, implicit trust, right? Like you join something and I trust you to be who you say you are.
Yeah. Or things that don't require the knowledge of who the user is. I mean, if you think about most modern systems, I can't think of many outside of just straight up marketing sites that aren't that don't have some notion of an identity, right? And
I agree.
And even those sites are pushing you to go and sign up, right? Sign up so that we can send you an account or create an account or sign up so that you can get access to some new part of the service that isn't available publicly. So mobile apps and web apps and all sorts of different things, there are very few out there that don't require some kind of an identity. Even games, which were historically just like, well, you got the discs to go play the game. Even a lot of games have sign-in. Like, I tried to play Doom the other day. Like, not new Doom, old Doom from 20 years ago. And I had to sign up for a Bethesda.net account.
Wow.
And I bought it from Steam, so I had to have a Steam account to buy that. And then now that account that I have is what's linking me to all these things, right? And so
Interesting interlude. Apparently, HP printers require you to have an account to print. To print.
Yeah,
I was
I'm not
reading on Twitter
surprised.
the other day. So for the last 2 years, they actually force you to create an account with HP when you buy an HP printer. And in fact, you also have to subscribe to getting toner from them. Otherwise, you cannot print without a valid account. It's insane. But it's the state of things. So HP needs to manage the accounts.
yeah, I mean,
Even
subscription, like,
printing.
that's the thing, right? You could buy a printer. You could buy a printer for a pack of gum. And
Yep.
you spend $7 at like Office Depot or Staples or something. You walk out with a printer, and it works for 2 weeks, 2 weeks of working from home, and then you got to go buy supplies, and those supplies cost a fortune. So now everybody's getting into subscriptions. That's the big thing. How do I do a subscription if I don't know who you are? I need your address. I need your credit card info or some kind of billing info so I can send you your stuff and charge you for it. Like, I just can't think of anything where knowing who the user isn't a critical part of the functionality. I mean, everything that we do on our cell phones, everything that we do at work or at school and at home, almost everything requires an account. I mean, even my 7-year-old goes upstairs and signs into the computer with his password because it's got restrictions on it and it's got stuff that he can do versus stuff that we can do. Like, I don't want him to access my stuff. I want him to access his. So, not knowing who a user is who's using your platform or using your software is almost a non-starter at this point. There's really just no way you could get away with not having any sort of idea who a user might be.
Yeah, it's highly unlikely that you'll be able to do anything on the internet today without an account of sorts.
Yep. And some of that sort of the nature of the internet, right? Which, if we think back historically, we didn't have the internet. All these machines weren't interconnected, and so when you needed services or when you needed to do something, there were all sorts of other ways to authenticate you to know who you were. So if you called your bank, they might say, "Hey, well, what's your birthday? What's your account number? And what's your what's a name you can call your dog and not your spouse?" Right? Like some kind of secret question that you had already hooked up or already set up. But a lot of that relied on a bunch of pre-existing information. That relied on information that you provided beforehand. What was your first car? Who was your best friend in 3rd grade? Right? Which I can't even remember anybody who was in 3rd grade. So it's sort of like, those kinds of questions are, it's sort of security through obscurity. It's a way to say, well,
Yes.
I don't know who you are, but you told me this answer earlier, and so I'm going to kind of use that as sort of a password. So it's knowing who a user is definitely going to be a difficult. It's a difficult problem to solve, but it's a required problem to solve. And so with most of the things that we need to access, and these could be applications, these could be databases, data about you, This could be your data and services that other people are holding. This could be your Gmail account or your Outlook.com account or your OneDrive or Google Photos or whatever. When I share photos with my spouse and my family and whatever, my kids, I have to choose people they're going to send to, because I don't want everybody seeing those. I want just the people I send them to. And so knowing who the users are is it's a hard problem to solve, and it's a problem that we have to solve in all walks of life. So yeah, you're trying to access a web app, you're trying to access your Gmail. Well, yeah, I need to know who you are, so you see your email and not somebody else's. But there's also the concept of sort of physical access, right? Of, well, how do I know how am I the only person who can get into my office? Not that I go to an office anymore, but back when we used to have to go to work, and back when we were still in school and could get into our dorm buildings and our classroom buildings, how did we get in? How did how do our professors and teachers and coworkers know that we are who we say we are, outside of us just saying, "Oh yeah, I'm John. I'm totally John. I promise." Right? I have an access card that I have to use to get into work. That access card is a physical segment of my identity.
Correct.
And physical identity has limitations, which is what makes it a little bit easier to sort of figure out physical security and physical identity. But digital identity is much more difficult, because we have all these different things that we have to account for.
Yeah.
So when we look at how we figure out who people are, how do we do that? And I'd be really curious what other people think in terms of, how do we know that somebody is who they say they are? How do I know that you're Christos, right? How did I know when I first met you, when you and I first joined this team? How did I know that that was your name, outside of you telling me, right?
No, I'm a double spy. I'm an agent.
Well, we each had, you and I both trust a common group, right? We both trust a common authority. You can call it an authority if you want. So the fact that you told me your name was Christos, and our boss, who we had some trust in, the fact that he told me that you were Christos, and the fact that you showed up in our address list, and that you could talk to me on Teams, and all those sorts of things. The fact that all those things happened, and they came from things that I trusted, I can say with pretty high confidence that you are who you say you were, right? Or I guess who you said that you are, because unless things have changed, you're still Christos. So
and it's the same for like, before joining Microsoft, I had to prove myself that I am who I say I am, and that my degrees are who they say they are, and what have you. So Microsoft also had to trust a common authority, right?
Yeah.
At which state was the state where I had to get an official passport and provide that. So, there is an official authority that needs to provide that information that everybody trusts.
Yeah, and that trust is very difficult. They always say you can blow away trust in no time, and it takes a lifetime to earn it back. And for a long time, human trust of who do we trust, and how do we trust that people are saying what they're saying, and how do we trust that what it's true and what's not true. I mean, we even see that now with all the stuff going on with disinformation and Facebook and Twitter and social media and all that sort of stuff. How do you trust? How do you choose who to trust, and how do you verify that the information you're getting hasn't been doctored, hasn't been changed, hasn't been falsified? Right? I mean, I remember back in like the 80s, which I don't remember because I was a wee infant in the 80s, but credit card machines where you put the card on the carbon paper and they went when they slid it, back and forth. They made all that noise. There's a whole lot of trust in there that card is still going to be valid. Same with writing checks. In fact, there's a lot of fraud that came about from people writing checks. They'd write a check and float the check because the check won't be presented to the bank for a couple days. So that gives you a couple days where if you don't have the money in there, you've got a couple days to get it in. There's a whole movie about it, and a whole the guy. There's a guy who did this. What was his name? Frank
Boucher?
No, he works for us. I don't think he was out kiting checks.
No, he was like Frank. I can't remember his name.
Yeah, Frank Abagnale. Thanks, Captain
Frank Abagnale. Yes.
Yeah.
Captain Squirrel.
So, yeah, Frank Abagnale, he used to do that, right? He'd write a check, he'd change the routing numbers and whatever, make sure it got floated off somewhere along, made sure and sort of added some misdirection so it took a long time to float it. And And, you know, it was a massive fraud, right? Because at that point, you're gone. The human who presented this check is long gone, right? And so all these systems sort of had some inherent system of trust, and some of them were stronger than others, and some of them weren't. And when we look at digital identity and who you are digitally, things are very different. Now, historically, this was pretty easy because computers were A, super expensive, B, super massive, and C, they tended to be the domain of the military, right? So, I mean, way back in the day, the physical security was sort of paramount. So you never logged into a computer, right? You were user 0 for that session. You were user 0. And user 0 was the only user that was in there, right?
You made it to the building, you have access to the resources.
Right, exactly. You make it to the building, and you can do stuff, which is really not that different from today. If I make it all the way into the building, I get free drinks, and you can buy food, and you can use the printers, and you can access computers and all that sort of stuff, right?
Correct.
Still physical security, though. Yeah, when I was in high school, we didn't have access cards or anything like that, but we had security officers who roamed the grounds. And so if they didn't know who you were, if you didn't have your ID card, you couldn't get in the school, right? And so that kind of physical trust meant that the resources inside of that were quite well protected. Not to mention, too, since this was mostly the domain of the military has a system of, making sure you are who you say you are, or you're going to pay the penalty, right? So there are definitely ways that you would be encouraged, I guess, to be truthful with your identity, because if you weren't, you would certainly pay the price, right?
Is that a big enough canon there?
I mean, I don't know. It could be. I mean, if you didn't, although that's a separate question. Is there ever such thing as a big enough canon? Is it ever big enough? I don't think so. But like, this was one of the first computers was at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. It was a U.S. Army installation, and that was the ENIAC, ENIAC, and it was a military installation, right? You can't get there without going through layers and layers and layers of various security protocols and lots of different people who need to know who you are before you ever got close to the high value resources, right? To the high value things. And again, all of these things trusted this sort of common authority. So the common authority here is, well, the security guards, they all have something that they can use to prove you are who you say you are. Now, part of the problem with that is that physical security works so well at keeping people out that now most of our businesses and enterprises are trying to do the same thing, right? So
tell me about it. The amount of customers that have asked me about that is insane.
Yeah. So a lot of businesses, schools, enterprises, small businesses, big businesses, whatever, they spend a ton of money and a ton of time designing these huge, massive networks, right? And they've got all these different layers to their networks, and they're essentially digging this giant moat around a castle, right? Because they want to reinforce this idea that if you get into the castle, then you're supposed to be here, right?
Right.
And unfortunately, that doesn't really work that well anymore, because I don't know about you, but I haven't been in the castle in about 8 months, right? And even before that, people worked from home, people worked from the car, they worked from a plane, they're traveling all over the world, whatever, trying to get work done. And so your physical presence within a building is really no longer any sort of a valid way to say, oh yeah, this person's here, thus they belong here, right? It's that whole see something, say something kind of a thing. And we see that over and over and over again in security. We see social engineering work where somebody walks into a business or they walk into a building, they've got a ton of confidence, and they say, oh yeah, I'm here to, Carl called me from upstairs, and I'm here to fix the, sprinkler system, so it's failing somewhere. And then Carl walks right through, right? Or the guy walks right through, and now has, physical access to your building, physical access to your systems, your servers, whatever. And so there's really just not a good future that involves There's really not a good future that involves relying solely on physical presence as a method of saying, yeah, you belong here. Somebody came and kicked my door in tonight and said, yeah, I'm inside, so I'm here. And I was just like, okay, man, cool, take what you need, see ya. Then, it's not going to work out well for anybody.
Yes.
So sadly, this idea that we can dig moat after moat after moat, it has two effects. The first one is it's not terribly effective, right? So having 4,000 different layers of network that you have to traverse in order to make this work, it doesn't really work that well. It does in the sense that it makes it very difficult to traverse things, but what happens when people get stuck? What happens when humans can't do something they feel like they're either entitled to do or need to do?
Okay.
They go figure it out. They figure out ways around it. They write passwords on stick-it notes and they stick them on their monitors, or they share passwords with their friends because, yeah, you could get in, but you know what? It's going to take you 3 weeks to get somebody to approve you to do this, so I'll just give you my password and we can just get stuff done, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And so people have gone and they build a little tiny footbridge, and they kick it across the moat for their buddies. So their buddies come in, they have a big poker party down in the basement of the castle, and now you got a bunch of people in there who you don't necessarily trust, right? And I just found this diagram on the internet. Nothing against this diagram in particular. It's just bleh. It's just so much. It's so much work and effort for preventing attacks, which is of course necessary in some degree, but it's a whole lot of work. And if you don't do this combined with making sure you sort of are understanding this identity and understanding how users get to what they need to get to, it's all for naught, right? This is one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is, well, how do I build an identity system that lets me build a moat around each one of my users, right? And that's kind of the key. Is we want, instead of building a moat around the resources themselves, we need a moat around people, so that people can't accidentally give their passwords out when they're streaming things on TV.
Yep.
They can't accidentally leak some kind of information. They can't accidentally leave their phone in a cab and suddenly have full access to everything, right? Or more germane, how do we enable new scenarios as developers to be in a place where, yeah, I want to build a cool calendar thing. I want to build an app that looks at your calendar and helps you schedule yourself better, or finds your free time, right? How do we do that when we know who the user is, but now some other app wants to do it? Do we know the developer? Can we trust the developer? Because I don't want you giving your username and password to some unknown developer, right?
Yep.
And so there's that whole side of, well, what do we do with these users, and how do we make sure the users themselves are protected is the other big half of this. So we've got moats, and we're moat builders, but we're going to build a moat around this, and we're going to build a moat around our people too. So historically we did this, and this has worked for a long time. We've had tons of networks are like this. Tons of networks are still like this, especially in sort of old school industries. There's still a lot of this attitude and a lot of this design that's still being floated. The problem is that computers have gotten really small, they've gotten really cheap, and they've gotten pretty powerful for what they are. So I mean,
oh yeah, even your toothbrush is more powerful than a PC from 20 years ago.
Right. I can go get a Raspberry Pi. The Pi Zero is like $5, and it's so cheap, in fact, that they sent out samples in a magazine that was like glued to the inside of a magazine when it first came out. It was $5. That's
how I got my Pi Zero, by the way. Still haven't used it, but we could find something to do.
We didn't get those in the U.S., so I didn't. We didn't get that magazine. Really? That magazine, I couldn't find it here in the U.S. So it was like, well, I could pay $30 and import one, or I could just pay $5 for the Zero. So I'll just buy the Zero.
But it was the physical acquisition that made it matter. But I'm sure.
Yeah. So computers have gotten extremely small, extremely fast, extremely powerful. They're very connected because we have the internet, we've got networks, we got all this sort of stuff now. And at the end of the day, the computers have evolved significantly faster than people, right?
Yes.
I mean, the proliferation of devices, I've got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 screens that are not my computer sitting on my desk, right? And then phones.
That's scary, by the way.
Phones and laptops and tablets and Alexas and all this sort of stuff, right? All these things, and they're all connected to the internet. And I'm logged into every single one of them. Every single one of these devices knows who I am through some type of login or some sort of security system. Because if I started seeing other people's photos on my like on my Alexa or something, I'd be pretty freaked out. Not a thing I want to do, right?
Remember the last major DDoS, distributed denial of service that they used the Mira OS or something? That it's an embedded operating system that runs on IoT devices.
Right.
And somebody found a security hack, and they took control of all these devices. So people that had cameras and toothbrushes that were connected to the internet, I don't know why your toothbrush needs to be connected anyway, were able to mount DDoS attacks against major networks.
Nice.
Just using distributed devices all over the world. That's scary.
Yeah, that is. It's pretty wild, though. Pretty cool.
Yeah.
I mean, the technical challenge of doing that, I think, would be pretty fascinating. So, so anyway, now we are no longer in our moat, right? Mm-hmm. I've got my cell phone. It sits in my pocket, and I'm driving all over the place and flying all over the place, and I'm at my house, or I'm at my buddy's house, or I'm at a restaurant, or I'm here, or I'm there. And these things are always connected all the time. And very, very different from sitting in a room with a computer that took up most of the room, that was capable of running, lots and lots of calculations very quickly. Very, very different. And a lot of the things that we think about when we think about identity and when we think about security and how do we make sure the right people are accessing the right stuff at the right time, a lot of those ideas are still sort of baked into this old school method of, well, if we block the perimeter, then you can get in. Of course, this is really common, right? The password fields. We see these all the time. Password fields.
Yeah.
We all have hundreds of passwords. I've got like 500 or something in my LastPass. It's completely ridiculous. And even today, in 2020, my wife and I can't share a Target account.
I hate that, by the way.
I've got to have I've got to share my password with her through something like LastPass or whatever, right? And of course, people being people, they share passwords. So they give passwords for everything, right? And so winter 2020 exclamation point is sadly a password that's probably in use right now thousands and thousands of times. And when you have to type in a different one for every single system, you start to remember them. And you're like, oh yeah, I'll just use this one again. Because it's the one that I know. My parents have a book, like a physical notebook that they write their passwords in. Which honestly, this means somebody has to break into their house to get it. So I'm kind of okay with that.
Yeah, it is better security than, I had a massive debate with Phil Stanley, who's a major security expert. And we used to work together. And I would always bang about password managers, and he would just be against it. He said, like, you know what, a physical book would be more secure than some password managers, depending on what you choose, obviously. But it was scary to think about that even security experts are struggling with storing and securing access to sensitive information.
Yeah, I mean, I have my LastPass master password written on a sheet of paper in the safe. Mm-hmm. So that if I keel over tomorrow, which I'm constantly reminded is always a possibility, if I keel over tomorrow, if I keel over tomorrow, my wife can at least get in to pay the bills and do all the stuff that, for the most part, are linked up to my account. So anyway, historically, and even today, this is still the most common way that most people. This is still the most common way that people sign users in. That developers build systems. What?
People on our chat are participating. Obviously, thanks everyone for your strong participation. If you want to get involved in the chat, then head over to twitch.tv/425show. We have somebody asking, are you going to explain OpenID Connect as well? We will, but that's like probably 5 sessions down, because right now we're starting at the very, very beginning, which is what is identity. But we'll definitely cover these things: OpenID Connect, OAuth 2, protocols, flows, everything that has to do with identity and security. So stick around.
Yeah, and if
you're
you're
joining us this morning.
Yeah, so if you're just joining us too, we're sort of kicking off a new series. The new series is going to be every Tuesday at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 Eastern.
Correct.
And on our main show, we do a lot of building, and we sometimes talk about the concepts behind why we're doing things a certain way, but we're going to try to explore those a lot more here. So we're going to try to spend
a lot of whiteboarding.
Sorry?
A lot of whiteboarding.
Yep.
For this session. Not a lot of code, mainly whiteboarding. We'll try to keep it language and platform agnostic so we can help you make the right decisions when it comes to implementing identity, right?
Yeah, so today we're kind of just introducing everything, and we're gonna talk a little bit about the history, which is kind of just what we're talking about now and what kind of problems we're solving. But the kind of problems that we're solving are problems that have been around for a really long time, and there are lots and lots of different ways that they have been solved, and lots of ways that they continue to be solved, because none of them are perfect. And so we are going to explore those a little bit today, and then on Tuesday next week, we're going to get into sort of a more in-depth history and talk more about federated systems and how they work. And in the subsequent weeks, we'll move into things like directories, then we'll start talking about protocols, all sorts of things like that. So, back to the main question of the day, which was this one from earlier, is proving with a high confidence that you are who you say you are. That's it. Just trying to figure out who somebody is based on some amount of information that they've provided.
Correct.
That means we have to have data up front, and they have to provide that data originally, which means we need some other root of trust that's beyond that. And sometimes, because the thing that we're doing is so low value that maybe it doesn't matter, right? It's not high-risk data, and so we just kind of take someone at their word to get started, and then they get started, now they've got a password for sort of, ongoing type things, right? So there are lots of different ways to do it, and we're going to explore a lot of what those look like. So, so the last thing is let's talk about these identity systems as being a little bit closer to home. We're going to get into federated identity and stuff probably next week, but we'll just sort of start, and we'll look at a modern, real-world identity system, if you want to call it that. Right? So this is a driver's license. I have one for driving here in the United States. You can get ID cards and whatever, but it's a pretty standard way to prove who you are and other attributes about you, which is key. It's kind of a different way to prove who you are. That's relatively universally accepted. So in most places, if I present my driver's license,
someone's asking, are you allowed to smile on your driver's license?
I mean, I guess Fire Penguin Disco Panda did, so I guess we all should. We should all follow in the steps of Fire Penguin Disco Panda. So, but driver's licenses are kind of an existing identity system, right? They've been around for a long time, and they do lots of different things. And so, the way that we use these and the way that we sort of have this trust, you'll see a lot of this when we start using other systems, right? When we start getting into digital systems, a lot of these same concepts flow over. So we've got this guy, this Fire Penguin Disco Panda guy, right? And Fire Penguin Disco Panda, he was smiling, I just didn't click the button fast enough. Fire Penguin Disco Panda wants to go to a bar, right? Mm-hmm. And at the bar, there's a dude there, right? And he's a big dude. He's got big gauges. He's pretty scary looking, to be honest. I mean, maybe not scary. That's a bad word to use, but he's pretty intimidating. I wouldn't want to go to him and lie, right? I wouldn't want to go to him and say, "Oh yeah, I'm totally 21 years old." What do you mean? What do you mean I'm not? But ultimately, our friend here, the bouncer at the club, he's the one he's relying upon somebody, right? He's what we call a relying party. So he's relying upon some sort of identity system so that he can make decisions. He can make authorization decisions. What can you do? Who are you? What can you do when you're here? And this is an interesting concept too, because in reality, he doesn't really care who you are. What he actually cares about is whether or not you meet certain criteria, right? Who you are, your name or whatever, Doesn't really matter. All he cares about is whether or not you're over 21 and old enough to get in the bar without the bar getting sued, right?
Or 18 for other parts of the world.
Whatever. It's California. I assume in California you got to be 21 to get into a club. So,
Agreed.
so he Fire Penguin Disco Panda goes to the club, tries to get through, and the bouncer says, "Well, I need to see an ID." Now, if he shows up with an ID that he hand wrote himself, or that he got from the Boy Scouts or something, our bouncer's probably going to be like, "Sorry, man, not good enough." Because there's no shared authority there. There's no shared trust between what this Fire Penguin Disco Panda guy can present and what our bouncer is expecting. So there's no sort of common authority there that says, yeah, this person is who you say they are or who they say they are, and you can trust this because you already trust me or because it's got some sort of validators or verifying marks. So instead he presents his normal driver's license. And the normal driver's license itself has a bunch of pieces of data on it. So at the top, of course, it's California DMV. So this is sort of like our identity provider. So in this case, California DMV is vouching for the fact that this guy's name is Fire Penguin Disco Panda. He lives somewhere in California. He's 5'7", weighs 150, and he was born on July 31st, 1984. Right? All those pieces of data are claims. You can think of them as claims. They're all claims that this user is making about this other user. They're all claims the identity system is making about this person. They're saying, oh, this person is has brown hair, has brown eyes, and has this birthday. So it's a bunch of pieces of data, and the pieces of data themselves are all sort of issued by this identity provider, by this shared authority. Now, because the relying party knows what California DMV is, and knows that California DMV issues driver's licenses and has their own set of identity checks, like you've got to have a birth certificate or you've got to have a passport or some other kind of identity. Because our bouncer knows those things sort of intrinsically about California DMV, our bouncer can say with relative confidence that, okay, this ID should be good. The problem is that this guy's possessing this. He possesses this, right? And so the card itself needs to have some kind of security features on it to make sure it's not tampered. And Robert Tables, to answer your question, yes. The shared authority vouches for the claims. The shared authority issues a set of claims and says, these are my key value pairs. These are my things that say date of birth is July 31st, 1984. And it's saying, the identity system is saying, yes, I know this to be true, right?
Yep.
The same way that when you sign in with your Google account, that Google says, I sign in and say that this user has this email address. It's exactly the same thing. So we have this identity provider, California DMV. California DMV is issuing a set of claims by issuing this driver's license with all these pieces of data on it. So it's saying this person's name is this person's name, or this person's address is here, this person's date of birth is this, whatever. So by issuing those claims, because there's this shared authority of this California DMV, the relying parties, the bouncer, the person at the gas station who you're trying to buy cigarettes from, the person at the grocery store you're buying booze from, they know, okay, I know what California DMV is, and so I can put these things in together. So the one extra step here is, while this says California DMV, it's just a bunch of ink on a card. So it's always possible that somebody makes a fake ID, right? Fake ID has been around probably since the first ID was ever generated. And so the fact that anybody could go and make one of these, right? The bouncer is now required to understand the security features of a DMV card and know how to recognize an authentic one, right? So there are all sorts of these weird things, these circles and different features, like the photo being superimposed on the back and different kind of holograms and holographic shifts inside the card. All those sorts of things are what lend to the validation of the card, right? That lend the relying party, the bouncer, to be able to say, I can say with fairly high confidence that this is a real ID because it looks authentic. It has all the security features, and all the security features are checked. Thus, I'm going to say I'm 99% confident that this is a real ID, and I'm going to let this person in, right? And the reason that he's letting this person in is because the date of birth is greater than his criteria. So our relying party's criteria is also not only who are you, how old are you, and if you reach a certain criteria, or if you meet a certain criteria, you're allowed to come in, right? And those two things together, those are sort of the combination of authentication and authorization. So the authentication is, well, who are you, and how do I know who you are with a high confidence? But the authorization, which is the two usually go really, really hand in hand. The authorization bit is the side that says, okay, now that I know who you are, and more importantly, I know certain pieces of data about you, now I can make decisions about that data as to what you can and can't do. So that you are over 21 means you can come into this bar. In reality, the bouncer doesn't need to know your name, address, anything. He just needs to know your identifying information to know that A, you're the person on the ID, and that B, the ID is valid, in order to trust that the 7/31/84 birthday is correct, right? So we got a couple questions too. I'm going to try to hit these quickly. So Vicious asks, how do you combine multiple IDPs into a single identity? And so a lot of that ends up being how I have multiple identities, in the sense that I have lots of different groups that have vouched for who my identity is. I have a birth certificate from where I was born, from the hospital, and the state, and the hospital and the state have a trust relationship between them. So the hospital can say, yeah, this person was born, this is all the information about them, so now I have this birth certificate, and the birth certificate is one sort of piece of ID. I might have a passport, but a passport requires some other pieces of ID in order to know who I am. DMV is going to require certain kinds of ID. It might require a social security card or some other kind of identifier. It might require an ID from another country if you're moving here from a different country. It might require an ID from a different state. And each one of those trust relationships typically has a set of trust relationships above it that get you to that point, right? So it's almost like a giant mesh. And what everybody's doing is every one of the players in these games is trusting and taking assumptions to some degree, assuming that the trust beforehand, the trust providers before these other ones, actually issued that trust and said, yeah, we validated who they were correctly. In some ways, it's also how these systems start to break down, is that if that trust isn't verifiable all the way through, so if California DMV had a big, let's say that they had a big, they had a problem with malicious insiders who were giving their friends fake IDs, or letting their friends get IDs that didn't really follow the most stringent requirements. Well, that causes the rest of this trust chain to start to break down, because now people have to go back and say, well, wait a minute, I don't know if that California DMV license was actually valid. And then we have to go and look at all of the other things that were issued based on the assumption of validity of this California driver's license. So, yeah, and there are lots of different ways to do verification. I could pick up the phone and say, this is somebody's, hey, California DMV, I'm, this person's trying to get into this club. This is their driver's license number. Is it correct? Or, more modernly, I might scan the barcode on the back. And that might make a back channel call to the California DMV to say, hey, here's a number. Is this a valid license? What's the data on this license? So there are lots of different ways to do that validation, but at the root, at the sort of the base level, most of the validation is done by the person who's consuming it. There's also a reason that the bouncer at the club doesn't pick up the phone and call California DMV, and that's because the risk outweighs, or the reward outweighs the risk. Am I really going to sit on the phone with DMV to let somebody into a club? No, because if it's Thursday night, Thirsty Thursday at the club, and I'm on the phone with DMV, nobody's going to get in until Friday. And then the rest of them won't get in until Sunday, and DMV will be closed anyway. So sometimes it's a matter of, well, does this even matter? Does this matter enough for me to go through a really hard validation to make sure, absolutely certain, how do we get those extra confidence points? But at some point, it's kind of diminishing returns, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a super basic example of identity systems, sort of the ones that we live with every single day. Yep. And it outlines some of their weaknesses too, in the fact that How do we know that the documents that were provided for California's DMV were actually valid? How do we know that they followed the same procedures that say we would for making sure these things are valid? How do we know this isn't fake? How do we know this hasn't been forged? How do we know it hasn't been modified? How do we know this isn't somebody's twin? How do we know this isn't somebody's older sibling who happens to look a whole lot like them, right? I mean, when I was like 14, I looked like my dad without a beard, right? So I could have taken his ID, especially his older IDs from when he was younger, and potentially gone and used those to masquerade as him. So in our sort of historic world, this is still something that happens all the time. But we have a lot more digital systems now to augment this type of a flow and to augment the validity of making sure these things are correct. So there's one other weakness too, which is that you have to share a whole lot of data about yourself in order for somebody to validate this, right? If I could buy a pack of cigarettes at the store, I don't really want the person knowing how much I weigh or how what my address is, right? They may not like me, or they may be like, oh, you know, look at this, this guy's doing blah 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 blah. Maybe I want to go, maybe I don't like him. Maybe I'll go, kick his door in or whatever. Like, we end up sharing a whole lot more extra information than we're really supposed to, or really is really necessary, because our driver's license has all this extra info on it. Really, the only thing that this relying party actually needs is to be able to have an identity system say, hey, this person meets your criteria, which is a very different question from who are you and what can you do, right?
Yeah, and we're almost passing into new terms like privacy and how much data you disclose for certain systems, because certain identity systems will abuse that information. So we need to balance it correctly between how much do you give out in order to be able to access a system.
Yep. It's kind of like, I don't know if you remember, when I was a kid, my mom would write checks, which for anybody who's under 30, a check is a thing that you write and you give to people in lieu of money, and they cash it in later. My mother-in-law, her check number is like, she's at like check number 47,000 or something. I've never seen anything like it.
Whoa.
But do you remember I remember my mom, she'd write her check and she'd add her name and address in the corner, and then she'd have to write her driver's license number. Maybe even something extra up there in the top corner, right? So anyway, so there are lots of different, there are all sorts of ways that we sort of use our identity in our daily lives, and the physical side of it helps remedy some problems, because there's only one of you, and there's ideally only one of you with the driver's license that says you are who you say you are, or that is presenting certain kinds of data to different people, and so the scale is much smaller. When we start talking digitally, it's much more difficult to make sure that trust is verifiable all the way through the chain, because people could be coming from anywhere in the world and accessing services that are anywhere in the world that have all sorts of different levels of government regulation or government ID, identification. And in some cases, we don't want government ID. If I'm going to go out and troll people on the internet, I don't want to use my government name, right? I don't want people to know who I am. So,
or maybe we should do that and make people accountable about what they say on the internet.
That sounds like a good intention that ends absolutely horribly.
Yes, I agree. I mean, it's a very sensitive subject, but
yeah. So anyway, so over the next, so this was just sort of today was just intended to be like a really quick intro to the show, and so we're gonna get out of here for a bit, but over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about these a whole lot more. We're going to be talking a whole lot more about next week. We're going to start with sort of the history of what does it mean when we're sitting in an office, or when we're sitting at school and we log into a computer, right? Like, what does that do? And then how have we been forced to change? How have we been forced to move to these newer sort of trust-free zones, right? There's a whole lot of trust that happens when you're sitting on a computer in a castle somewhere with a moat dug out around it. There's a whole lot of trust that implies that you made it past the guards, that you got into the office, that you sat down, that you opened the computer, and that you managed to log into it. There's a whole lot of implied trust there. And when we're doing all this over the internet, which is essentially the Wild West, how do we ensure that same level of trust? How do we make sure that things don't get where they get to a point where we aren't giving people access to things that they shouldn't? Because as we all know, giving people access to anything that they shouldn't, once it happens, it's fairly hard to put that cat back in the bag. You can just ask Target, Equifax, Home Depot, all the different huge companies that have had these kind of problems where they've had data breaches and everything else. I mean, there was one just last week. Somebody left a Mongo database or something out in a container. It was like hundreds of millions of people's health records or something. I don't remember.
Still Mongo? Come on! I mean, Mongo has been going on for what, 3 years now? I mean, it's one of the attack vectors, right? So it's not the only one, but Mongo has been notorious. But I think what the other thing that we need to discuss is not just what the system or who the system allows to go in. It's the inverse as well. As a user, how do I trust that whatever I'm accessing is not going to, be insecure, so my data ends up in one of these dumps? So it's both ways, right? As a developer, you need to make sure that the users are who they say they are when they come into your system and provide the appropriate authorization. And on the inverse, the users need to be able to trust your solution to not leak data. So it's a challenging proposition and something that we hopefully give you enough information to solve effectively and securely. Are there any free IDPs for non-profit and early startups? Vicious, if you have a non-profit company, there is actually a free Azure account that they can acquire. I think they get $3,500 per month. By the way, the Azure subscription is only required for Azure AD. Azure AD is free, but be aware that B2C is free for under 50,000 and you can get a full Azure subscription with $3,500 for any non-profit out there. Let me know if you, and I think there are startup programs as well. It used to be BSpark. I don't know if that's still available. JP, do you know if BSpark is still around?
I don't know. I burned all 3 years of my BizSpark, so I don't know. There's something for startups, so I don't think it's called BizSpark anymore. But there are definitely startup programs. We'll find out by next week. We'll know.
Hit us on the 45show at Microsoft.com with any questions you might have or any challenges, and we'll be more than happy to help you out and point you the right direction. And Discord, Discord is not an IDP though. It's a chat, right?
No, I think for reaching out to us.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, in Discord. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. I need more coffee this morning. Yeah. Still on my first cup.
So anyway, so we're going to explore these topics over the coming weeks. We do a regular show on Mondays and Fridays at the same time, 8 a.m., where we look into more of the how, and we're building things back and forth. So if you'd like to come and hang out with us on Mondays and Fridays, we're also around. We usually have lots of guests, and it's a bit of a circus and a bit of a party. But we will likely take concepts that we hit during our regular 425 show. We will take those concepts and bring them back here to explore them more deeply and explore sort of why we make some of the identity decisions that we do on the show. So we hope to see you next Tuesday, but also this coming Friday. What do we have going on this coming Friday, Christos?
This coming Friday, we have Lila coming back for a third time in a row, third time lucky, to finish our ASP.NET identity migration to Azure AD B2C and then adding Twilio for two-factor authentication. Yes, Vicious, Lila is awesome. For the first part of the show, and then for the second part of the show, we have Danny Martins, a PM from the Cloud Shell team, that is coming to do an intro on Cloud Shell and show us how identity fits in there. So it's gonna be super interesting stream on Friday. Join us to make sure you don't miss it. And if you can't join us live, then always the content is always available on YouTube. 45 show ak.ms/45show/ YT for the YouTube channel.
Yep.
And with that, we need to plug in the next thing on Learn TV today. Right after our show, we have Scott Hanselman and Chloe Condon doing a live Q&A for the festive tech calendar. So it's gonna be super fun. Do not leave the stream. Don't go anywhere else. Make sure to stick around. And thanks everyone for joining us this morning. We hope that you find this interesting. If you have questions, again, reach us on Discord and by email or via email to let us know what you would like us to cover on the show. What would you like to know? What is been torturing you or keeping you awake at night?
Yep. So we'll be back next week with more on the history of identity and the history of identity systems. We'll be Friday on the 425 show building more B2C with SMS MFA. And in the interim, send us an email, ping us on Discord, tell us what you'd like to see, tell us what kind of identity problems you have, and we will see you all later next week or later this week and again next week. Have a great afternoon. Stick around for Scott Hanselman and Chloe.
Yeah.